second China International Import Expo in Shanghai, Chinese President Xi Jinping said China's door of opening up will only be wider and wider. But with pressure on the global economy and trade growth, globalization is likely to face further challenges from unilateralism and protectionism. What's the message coming from the second China International Import Expo? Could the Asia-Pacific Trade Pact, RCEP, and productive China-U.S. negotiations help boost the confidence in globalization? And where are global trading trends heading overall? To discuss these issues more, I'm very happy to be joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Zhang Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, and Charles Tang, Chairman of the Brazil-China Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We'll also speak via satellite to Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State from Italy's Ministry of Economic Development in Shanghai. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to Dialogue. President Xi Jinping says over and over the Chinese government is ready to further open up its economy. Our door of opening up will be wider and wider. He says so over and over. What message does he deliver to the rest of the world, Charles?
Well, since his very moving speech in Davos, when President Trump withdrew from the Paris Accord, the world has looked up to Chairman Xi Jinping in China as the leader of globalization and as a leader of the Paris Accord. With President Trump's and the U.S. isolationism, Chairman Xi is carrying the flag in defense of globalization and of the Paris Climate Accord. So I think that the CIE is another brilliant move to show the world that China is open for business, and China is not only the exporter of the world, the largest exporter of the world, where some of the complaints in the U.S. come from, but also a very huge importer, and that the whole world can participate in this tremendous market of maybe 900 million middle-income people market. So I think the message is very, very strong. And the fact that Chairman Xi Jinping has been there now for the second edition shows the great importance he attaches to be the leader of the globalization efforts against some of the efforts that are trying to isolate anti-globalization. As I mentioned in the past, history will remember Chairman Xi Jinping as a Chinese leader who has created and is creating a major leadership role for China, global leadership role.
John, are you sure that President Emmanuel Macron has heard the message that President Xi conveyed about maintaining the sheet balance in our import and export process?
I think, of course, he does. I mean, his speech, in addition to the trade issue, the issue of globalization, I think Macron's interest is mostly on the climate, addressing the climate issue. He keeps talking about enhancing, French and Chinese commitment to the Paris goal. Enhancing its commitment. In other words, they raised the bar a bit more. So I think, he is probably more concerned about the climate issue other than just the trade issue. I think his agenda is probably broader than what President Xi, spoke in this great speech.
China is the world's second largest importer after the U.S. How can the Chinese economy explore the potential of higher imports? I mean, we enjoy a large trade surplus. That has made President Trump extremely unhappy. But despite the media coverage about the deliverables coming out of the Phase 1 agreement between the two biggest economies, Charles, are you confident that we'll deliver more on the promise of having more imports?
Well, coming from Brazil, it's a completely different picture. As you know, last year, because of the trade war, Brazil had the largest surplus in its trade with China in history. Brazil had a $29.5 billion surplus last year, and the trade volume between Brazil and China surpassed $100 million for the first time. So from the Brazilian point of view, Brazil is exporting a lot more to China because of the trade war. 90% of the soybean crop last year was exported to China. Brazil even had to import for its own consumption soybean from the United States at a 25% discount. So although countries like the United States do have a deficit in its trade relationship with China, many countries in South America, the bread baskets of the world, such as Argentina and Brazil, are enjoying surpluses. And because of these surpluses, and because of the Chinese investments in Brazil, Brazil has an enviable foreign currency reserve position of about $400 billion.
John, global trade growth is facing downward pressure. So is the Chinese economy. And such adverse circumstances, what do you make of the prospects that are enormous input into maintaining the balance of the sheet will pay off?
Well, there's no doubt that we are heading to a recession, if not already getting to recession, I think. So that creates a lot of challenges. But the world is looking towards China as a sort of a locomotive for the world economy. And Chinese consumers' pockets is a solution to that. And I think we're exactly doing that. We're opening up a market. China's open for business. We're trying to import more stuff from the rest of the world. As Mr. Tang said, we have a huge trade surplus with the United States, something close to $400 billion. But overall, trade surplus is actually about just half of that. It's a lot smaller. That means that we actually maintain trade deficits with several resource-rich countries, including Brazil, Australia, Canada, these countries. So, but that still, about $200 billion is a very large amount, and we need to, overall balance trade with our major trading partners. So I think, as I said in the past, a persistent large trade surplus is not sustainable over the long run, both politically as well as economically. We're going to run into problems, not just with the United States, with actually many countries. Even those, these countries in very friendly countries in Africa, for example. Chinese exports of manufactured goods are very competitive. And if you look at the trade picture with these countries, it's a one-sided story. So we have a huge trade surplus with these countries. And I think over the long run, if we don't address that, it's going to be very problematic in the future. So I think in the end, we need to increase imports. It's good for the Chinese economy. It's good for the world economy.
Thank you very much. Let me cross over to Michaela Geraci, who was standing by in Shanghai, where he attended the opening ceremony as well as some of the parallel discussions. All of them, we had altogether 4 parallel discussions about different subject matters, and I believe Michaela must have been through most of the process and got his own feeling about deliverables that this conference about import deliver. So Michaela, what can you tell us about your general feeling concerning the outcome of this second import expo that was held in Shanghai?
My feeling is quite positive. It is the second time they attend. Of course, I was there last year. I think last year was mostly being the first round, more of a political, with the blessing of President Xi. Leaders came, we came, and this time around, I believe the focus is shifting more onto trying to get more practical deals. The number of companies is around 3,000. I have seen lots of activities, people walking in the stands. Like all fairs, it is never so easy to estimate what practical and specific deals will come out of it. But the important thing is that this event puts so many people together from so many countries, organized in countries' pavilions, industrial pavilions, so people who are interested in specific products can go and visit those of them. I tell you, I have personally, literally by hand, spent weeks and months to design, contributing to the design of the Italian pavilion, just to offer to the Chinese visitors the idea of what Italy is about, a mix of art, history, culture, machinery, technology. And this is what every country is trying to do, to basically use these few days to tell the world, hey, we don't just do what you think we do, but we also do something else. And this is exactly the goal that I have planned for the Italian week here. We don't just do food, fashion, the thing that people know about, but we also do high technology machinery, we do satellites, and we do also agricultural machinery. That is the area where we think Italy and China can cooperate very much, both in the China itself, but as it was mentioned before, in Africa, where China is a heavy investor, 400 billion stock of investment over the last several years, and where Italy can contribute to bring its know-how, the food chain, food packaging, and all the skills. So I have a positive feeling. We will see what the results will be. I'm here exactly to monitor this, even if I am not in an official government capacity anymore, at least for the time being, but it is even better to be able to go down to the more specific details and help Italian company and Chinese company come together. The closer they get, the more likely that something happens, just like in nuclear fusion.
We have noticed, Michele, dynamics of the cabinet reshuffle in Italian politics. We hope you would become a key member of the next Italian government. You have our blessing, by the way. But you know, despite enormous efforts by the Chinese authorities,
I will try to satisfy your desire as soon as possible.
Well, I keep our fingers crossed for your political
future. Do the best.
But what do you think of, you know, protectionism that is looming larger about China's efforts to import more high-tech products? We face the constant threats from the U.S. government about blocking China's efforts to import more of digital technologies like Huawei. Where does Italy stand on this sensitive issue?
I tell you, having been part of a government that was so-called populist, I'm on the spectrum away from those who believe that free trade is good at all costs. There are two misunderstandings. First of all, free trade is good only under certain assumptions, one of which is full labor mobility. So if a country meets that requirement, then trade will be beneficial for the country itself. Now in Italy, labor law, people's way of thinking, language skills, willingness to move to other countries is not so strong. And so one of the key assumptions of the benefits of free trade fails its test in Italy. Italy is a large exporter. We have 1/3 of our GDP coming from export. So indeed, we do want to trade, we do want to sell, we do want to buy. But one thing is to trade, one thing is to trade on a free term with zero barriers, zero checks. One other thing is the free trade agreement that includes other things like investment protection that goes even beyond what the economic theory tells us about the benefits of trade. So my stance is yes to trade, but not free liberal trade, because this is the free liberal trade is a Darwinian process. It increases the average, but within the average there are the losers. It's like the giraffes whose neck is not tall enough to capture the leaf high in the trees, and what happens to them? They die out. And this is how the population, on average, increases its quality, by getting rid of the weak ones. Now, we cannot do this with people, and that's why we are a little bit with what I call it managed protectionism, which paradoxically, it's normally something that was handled by the left-wing party, let's say, paying more attention to the weak spectrum of the society. Now things have turned. We that are told to be on the right side of the spectrum want to do this managed protectionism just to protect those weak parts. In Italy, we have 5 million people below poverty line, a very high percentage, I dare to say almost double that of China in proportion. And this is not because I don't want to trade, it's not because I want to put tariffs, it is because my country is not ready to face the challenge of China manufacturing 2025, manufacturing Vietnam. We have a great deal of overlap, and so we need to be careful on the speed and the extent of opening up trade. It doesn't mean to put walls, it doesn't mean to go back to autarky. Those that say that don't really understand the meaning of this. And even the United States is relaxing its stance on this issue, but a little bit of tariff, a little bit of protection just to give time to our people to breathe and learn that the world is changing. They get used to new trade, to the challenges of technology, and then we can open. So speed and extent of opening up the market is crucial, and China does a very good job.
Thank you very much, Michele.
If China were to be open today immediately, it would be very bad.
In a few minutes. I'll get back to you in a few minutes. But John, Italy, of course, deserves the credit for being the first EU27 to have broken up the silence on BRI, right, and they have signed up the BRI memorandum. Having said this, what do you think of the latest development in our exchange regime? RMB has appreciated a little bit against the expectations of some of those pessimistic voices. What do you think of the impact the RMB appreciation may deliver on the sheet of balance?
Well, I think the appreciation of renminbi, actually to a very limited scale, certainly helps our capital accounts. I think it slows down a little bit the capital outflow, but also causes a little bit difficulty on the exports market. But you know, Chinese companies, I always have a lot of faith in them. I mean, these challenges are not going to stop them, slow them down. You know, Chinese products, Chinese companies are still very competitive on an international scale. So I think overall, you know, China's exports is not going to be slowed down too much by this little appreciation of RMB. I think the driving force behind this is what I'm guessing, is that there got to be some kind of agreement reached maybe between Vice Premier Liu and the American side, Lighthizer, for example, in Washington, D.C. during last time's talk, that they want to stabilize the yuan's movement. It has been quite a very fast run-up in U.S. dollar vis-a-vis RMB for the last couple of weeks, you know, rapidly rising from 6.7 all the way to like 7.2, I think. This is something that the American companies are finding very difficult for the export products here in China. And certainly from Washington's perspective, they want a weaker, they want a stronger yuan, that's for sure. So my guess is that China made some concession. I think one of the three things actually, right, mentioned in this first phase one agreement is with respect to the foreign exchange currency here. And I think that's probably, you know, kind of a maybe agreement that both sides have reached. That's just my wild guess. But I don't have any real evidence to support it, of course.
Well, we've heard a mixed voice about the impact of a slight appreciation of the RMB. Do you think this is likely to be a little gift by the Chinese authorities ahead of concluding the phase one agreement between the two biggest economies? President Trump is a face-loving guy, and he wants to have some gift from the business partner like China ahead of the 2020 election, right?
I'm sure that any agreement, if reached, and it should be reached, will allow President Trump to boast that he won a big victory. I think that the slight movement in the exchange rate, of course, worries the United States a lot. And like Mr. Zhong said, it is a thorn in the issue. I think, however, that I agree with him that the Chinese exports will not be slowed by the slight movement of the currency exchange rate.
With regard to the prospects of reforming the WTO, let me get back to Michele Geraci. Because on this issue of multilateralism as opposed to unilateral policy moves, particularly by the Trump administration, the European Union, of course, takes sides with the rest of the world in safeguarding free trade and multilateral institutions. But look, to my knowledge, by the end of this year, the appellate body of the WTO is likely to come to an end with only one judge remaining on the panel. That almost seals the fate of the WTO, because after all, the appellate body is viewed as the jewel of the crown. If that ceases to exist, what would be the impact?
The impact would be bad because there would be no committee that could settle dispute. However, I want to bring another angle. The problem is that if the system is not optimum for all parties involved, it is then that they recur to a judge. So the need to have a judge, the appellate body, I think it betrays an intrinsic fragility of the system. It's like a marriage that only when you have a problem you go to the judge or to court. Now, we want to make sure that the WTO works and indeed set the rules, but these rules should be in a way efficient, maybe Pareto efficient for all parties. So no one has an interest in free riding on the other one. And it seems to me that this is not the case yet. Why is that? Because the WTO and the rules of anti-dumping were initially designed to deal with small countries in Asia, low, cheap producer of goods, and the problem was to try that those countries would not subsidize unfairly and bring overall world market down below the prices of the, let's say, more developed countries that would purchase those. This worked until the emergence of China. With the emergence of China, that makes pretty much 50% of everything that is made around the world, the question then arises, what is the reference price in the international market? Is it the Chinese domestic market, or is it the rest of the other 199 countries around the world? And China would claim that just because of the massive scale that it has achieved, the reference price is the Chinese price. In other words, China says, I am the world market because I'm the efficient player. The reason why my prices are cheaper is not because we do dumping, which there may be too, but because we produce 800
yes,
million
indeed,
tons
China
of steel.
does
And
boast
you,
of
United
the most
Europe,
sizable
only do 100 million. So
middle class,
hard to compete.
which is a formidable army of consumers to stimulate that domestic consumption against the adverse circumstances of trade war. But Charles, along with the ROK, Brazil beats a retreat from the position of being regarded as a developing country, and that has set the tone perhaps for many other emerging markets about giving a second look to their giving a second look at the status in the world trading order. Because President Trump complains bitterly that many of the developing countries have become or been transformed into a developed ones. China, he says, is no exception. Now, what do you think of the argument that China is a big developed economy? China says no, we are still the biggest developing country, and that has a lot to do with whether many economies would be regarded with a special view as a part of a differentiated policy.
Well, of course, the Chinese economy has grown very, very much. But however, if you take a look at the income per capita, the Chinese income per capita is still like 1/5.
You mean per capita income?
Per capita income.
We are around 70.
$10,000.
Yeah.
$10,000.
Purchasing power parity calculation is about $18,000. It's still low.
Still very low.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, China is a large developing country. If you take the total economy of China, of course, it's growing by leaps and bounds. And it's the locomotive, like John said, it is the locomotive of the world economy today. And I think that Brazil is far from reaching the stage where China has already achieved. Although President Bolsonaro, when he came to China just recently, was so impressed by China, although his initial view of China was not so positive, he has changed his mind completely, to the extent that he announced that he will exempt the Chinese citizens from having to have a visa to go to Brazil. So I think that
will be a boost in the number of Chinese travelers who would prefer to take a look at Brazil. other than the issue of a football match. That's something we feel extremely sorry for the Chinese team. But John, what do you think of the chronic issue of taking China as a developing country or the other way around?
Well, you know that I published an article in China-U.S. Focus, which is a website sponsored by Mr. Zhang in Hong Kong. My view is that the current system, the system of dichotomous classification of countries, all countries into only two categories, is certainly very simplistic. I think it simplifies the very complex economic landscape in the world. China is definitely not going to be the same as some of the least developed countries in Africa, for example. And I've been proposing using a four-category system currently being used by the World Bank. World Bank has a system called GNI, Gross National Income Classification. They have the low income, middle income, upper middle income, and high income class. So I think more enriched classification of the world economies, and also building a graduation system. One of the things that President Trump is complaining about this current system at the WTO is that it doesn't institute an evolutionary graduation system. But the GNI system in the World Bank, by definition, updates that country status every year, and the threshold values for each category keeps changing. So I think this is a very good system. WTO system and World Bank system is synchronized. They have they have the same policies essentially to help those poor countries, developing countries. And so I think from China's perspective, we don't actually I've been proposing that we should really consider as an idea of a more enriched classification of WTO, as opposed to sticking to the same, very difficult to defend argument that China belongs to a developing class. Even though overall our income is still, I think the per capita calculation is still very fundamental to this calculation. And China's $10,000 per capita fits somewhere in the middle. And I think based on the GNI's classification, we're in the upper middle income class. So I think that's a more of appropriate status.
That's a very interesting paradigm. Thank you, John. Let me quickly go to Michaela. You only have 1 minute, Michaela, to sum up your views about whether China should be regarded as a developing country or a developed one, because the debates have been going on and on as to whether there should be major changes in the attitudes towards China's position in the world trading body or the trading order. What do you think? You have only 1 minute.
I am proposing to have a quadrant, so 4 boxes, low income and a small country, high income, large country, and so on. And China would fit in a large economy, but developing, like we heard before, large economy, but low income per capita. Very different from countries that have same income per capita and they are small economy. So I would divide the world into 4 areas.
Thank you so much, Charles, John, and Michaela, for your contributions to this very insightful and enlightening discussion about the CIIE, the second of its kind, about China's import efforts to improve remarkably, hopefully, the balance of sheets under the adverse circumstances of the trade war between the two biggest economies. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.